coming up on Chopper's Brexit Podcast.
I think it's absolutely brutal. I mean, in what other walk of life would you have, your career change, losing your job so publicly broadcast?
Hello and welcome to Chopper's Brexit Podcast. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. I'm speaking to you, as always, over a cup of coffee at the Red Lion pub in the heart of Westminster. Just when you thought things had slowed down, they sped right up again. A shock Irish election result, a cabinet reshuffle, and an offer to spend the night with London mayoral candidate Rory Stewart. If that one's gone right over your head, you clearly don't spend as much time on Twitter as I do. And on today's show, we'll be covering the first two at least. Legendary Irish journalist Ruth Dudley-Edwards will be telling you everything you need to know about the Irish election result and what it means for Brexit. And former head of press at Number 10, Giles Kenningham, will be giving us his view on how reshuffles work as Boris Johnson announced who's in and who's out. Plus Lucy Morrell from Britain Thinks on whether Britons can ever heal their Brexit divisions. Now, for most of us, losing your job might involve an awkward conversation in a side room with HR, maybe a week or two of saying your goodbyes, being escorted out the office by security, cutting all ties with your former colleagues, legal action. That's just me. Anyway, for cabinet members, it's splashed all over the front page of newspapers. You have to work alongside their replacements, some of whom may have worked for you in the past. All very awkward. And one man who knows what MPs are going through right now is veteran spin doctor and former head of press at Number 10 and the Tory party, Giles Kenningham, who is now the founder of Trafalgar Strategy, the public affairs and PR agency. Giles, welcome back to the Red Lion pub.
Thank you, Chris.
You've been here a few times. I've been with you before drinking here.
Exactly, busy plotting away in the basement here.
So in the basement here, in this kind of hobbit-like dungeon, and above the ground, political intrigue is taking place in real time on 24-hour news. When you were doing these reshuffles, how many did you see or were you part of when you were in David Cameron's government?
I think we must have sat through about three or four. Famously, David Cameron didn't like doing reshuffles because invariably you annoy more people than you get on side.
That's great for journalism, though. We like annoyed people. That's what's good for us.
And I think the power of the reshuffle is reshuffle. You're strongest when you're doing it, but after it, you're at your point of maximum vulnerability. I think one of the reasons why he didn't like doing it was because, running big government departments are like running FTSE 100 companies, and famously, I think
with big budgets,
it takes people ages to get their heads around the brief. Something like the NHS is incredibly complex. And I think it was Nicky Morgan who, after 2 years as education secretary, when she got sacked by Theresa May, said she'd only just got her head around the brief, which is quite normal. So continuity, I think, is really important. Obviously, Boris Johnson is coming at this with a fresh mandate, a huge majority. So hopefully you're going to see people left in the big briefs for a while, sort of master them and have a clear sense of direction.
What are your lessons from reshuffling 4 times when you were working for David Cameron? What's your clue to getting it right?
Yeah, I think obviously the world's changed quite dramatically in terms of social media over the past 6-7 years.
But Twitter's now a big thing.
Yeah, I think and actually this is the whole thing. You can harness social media to try and control the narrative by the reshuffle. So what I mean by that is obviously you can use Twitter to get the announcements out so everyone has it at the same time. But also I think there's a big thing here because reshuffles invariably are process stories. Who's up, who's down, who are the disgruntled ministers going back to the backbenches, who's going to cause trouble. So you've got to try and have an overarching narrative about the day, which is much more about what does this mean for the future direction of the government, where's it going, who's the new blood, who's coming in. I think that's where you can use social media quite powerfully. So, if I was in there, I'd be saying to every time, if I was in there now, I'd be saying after every new minister's been appointed, let's do a video about the key messages of the day. Yeah. And also it comes down to the choreography about people walking up Downing Street. Yeah. The way these things are normally done is you do the sackings first in the PM's office, so people don't have to go through the humiliation of walking up Downing Street. Then you go through to appointing the new blood. And I suppose one way of doing it is to sort of bring in the new blood first, so the young talent, the women, so you have this message of change, and then you finish off on reappointing some of the old hands. So it's change with continuity.
And behind the scenes, what's going on in Boris Johnson's study that we know? I think there's a big whiteboard, isn't there?
Normally there's this big whiteboard, and invariably something always goes wrong. So I could think of a couple of instances when I was in government. John Penrose got accidentally sacked because we ran out of ministerial appointments. We were told by one of the civil servants that constitutionally we couldn't appoint any more ministers. So he was sacked and they had to be brought back in the next reshuffle.
Did he mind?
I think, I wasn't privy to the exact conversation, but it was quite a thick of it moment. And then there was this infamous moment of the whiteboard falling down, which had all the names on Post-it notes on it. And there went someone's career crashing to the floor.
Literally fell off the wall,
and names get forgotten. Invariably, something will go wrong, so someone won't accept a job. Or I think when I was in there, Justin Greening famously spent 2 hours being persuaded by my then boss, Craig Oliver, to take the job as International Development Secretary, which he didn't want, which then holds everything up. Because
it's like a Rubik's Cube.
It is a Rubik's Cube.
You're trying to
moving parts around, or there's horse trading going on, there's shuffling. I think in 2018, Jeremy Hunt, Theresa May wanted to move from Health Secretary to be sort of the Cabinet Office enforcer, and he said no. So then she had to rethink what was going on. And invariably, it depends on how powerful the Prime Minister is. And obviously at that time, without a majority, she wasn't that powerful.
Jeremy Hunt now, of course, chairman of the Health Select Committee, but he used to wear this NHS pin badge, which I think he was wearing it came off, went on again, and then we could track his views on whether he was safe or not by the badge.
Yeah. I mean, there was also one other story which comes to mind, I think, IDS in 2012.
Ian Duncan-Smith?
He was being mooted to be moved from DWP Secretary of State to the Justice Secretary of State. Now, that had been heavily trailed, and it ended up really annoying him. And I think he went in to see David Cameron and said, it's fine, I'll go back to the back benches and support you from there, which obviously sounded the alarm bells. It ended up being,
so he wasn't moved, was he?
Yeah, so he wasn't moved. Once again, I said it comes down to the political backdrop. We're in a coalition, you've got many moving parts. Boris Johnson's got quite a strong hand to play, so he can be quite brutal in terms of what he does and setting a clear sense of direction. It's not many people will have the upper hand when they go in that room.
Yeah, exactly. And Giles, you talked there about how the new ministers walk in at number 10, but what's it like for the old ministers watching people who they work with, their friends, getting their jobs? How can they stomach that?
I think it's absolutely brutal. I mean, in what other walk of life would you have, your career change, losing your job so publicly broadcast? And I was never with a cabinet minister who got sacked, but I was in a department when junior ministers got sacked and got moved on. And I remember a couple who were brilliant, and it wasn't a reflection on their performance. It was more to do with circumstances. And it is, really brutal, and how quickly things change. How this is the civil service then does move at breakneck speed. You see the new name being put up on the wall, all the resources
on the website,
all the resources, all the offices being cleared out. The new minister comes in. Really tough.
What's your advice? Because if you do get to Minister of State level and don't get the jump into cabinet and you're pushed out of government, they've just elected all these new select committee chairmen just earlier this month. What do you do? I mean, it's quite a sad moment for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, either you dwell on it or you move on. And as you said, there are other opportunities. There's the select committees, and actually one would argue they can be incredibly powerful.
Jeremy Hunt is now the chairman of the Health Committee.
Jeremy Hunt is, chair of the Health Select Committee, DCMS and the Home Office Select Committees, I think, historically been very powerful, and have claimed scalps and have really changed the direction of stuff. But I think, yes, there is that period of, you go from having your chauffeured car to having everything, your life
get
run
on the
for you.
tube like everyone else.
To going back to, having this huge gap. I think the question for people when this happens is, do you look to find certain campaigns that you fight on the back benches? But also, I think what you've seen increasingly more and more, I think, in the past few years is people then choosing to step down and go back into business or pursuing a different career path, because it is a different gear change. You have to really love the kind of mechanics and dynamics of being in Parliament if you get.
But I think people look younger. I mean, I think people. Someone's told me recently, Anna Soubry, now she's left Parliament, looks a lot better.
Well, there was the famous thing that
I think Amber Rudd looked better.
Yeah, the famous thing that William Hague said, that when he stopped being Tory leader, everyone said every year he looked younger having done it. So I think there is that relentless pressure where you're never off, especially now with mobile phones, social media. So it does, to some extent, I'm sure, it does take its toll.
So they might be unemployed, but they're happier, Giles, this weekend.
Well, they're not necessarily unemployed because they're still MPs, Chris.
Yes,
but they've had to take a big pay cut. Yeah.
Yes, but they lost their big job, and they're back to what they do, but they're happier people.
Yeah, perhaps they get a column in the Telegraph now.
We'll bear that in mind, yes. The perils also of 24-hour news. There was a story, wasn't there, about a BBC reporter, Norman Smith, announcing a story, and then...
Yeah, this is definitely one which has to enter into a book. I think Chris Grayling was Conservative Party chairman for 30 seconds in January 2018, and what happened
he was Transport Secretary at the time.
He was Transport Secretary at the time.
Yeah.
Norman Smith, the BBC's chief political correspondent, was outside Downing Street. He did a snap saying, I understand Chris Grayling is going to be appointed Conservative Party chairman. The digital guys in CCHQ saw this, took their lead from him, thinking, well, it must be correct.
BBC saying it's true.
Yeah, BBC, never wrong for long. Took it as a green light, put out an infographic statement, but it was wrong.
Saying Chris Grayling is new party chairman.
So it had to be taken down. There were lots of red faces. So yeah, the recipe for things to go wrong, especially with social media, is huge.
What was your advice to future ministers, the new group appointed? Will there be interviews with these new ministers? And what's your advice to them if you were advising them now?
I always think it's dangerous when you see ministers go out and do interviews with you straight away.
Generally, or you just at any point in their history.
You and also other journalists, just because how can you be across the brief straight away? I think it's really important. Sounds quite glib to have your special advisors in place because you need that political will in departments to be able to push through change.
And their job, of course, is to talk to journalists, to MPs, and get
stakeholders to actually help run the department and actually pull it in the direction that the minister wants to go. And I do think it's quite simple. You get your special advisors in place, but also spend that time really reading in. And I think you need 2 or 3 really big things you're going to want to change and focus on them in terms of driving the machine. But why it only works with a sense of momentum. It's got to be fast, breakneck speed to make things happen. Otherwise, the bureaucracy takes over.
And don't you think if essentially civil servants always win? Because on my wall in the Telegraph office in the House of Commons, I've got literally 6 governments going back about 4 years. Every time a new government comes along, I print out this huge 3-metre long piece of document, just stick on the wall so I can see who's in the government. And it's amazing how often it changes.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they always win. Look, really good civil servants can be integral to the process and help you push
work with them
to help push through that change. Occasionally you do get some people who see their pet projects being ripped up and don't like them. But in the private offices, which are integral to how cabinet ministers run the department, you have a good private office. It's like having a Rolls-Royce service, and it will transform how you can do stuff.
Well, Giles Kenningham, thank you so much for coming on Chopper's Brexit podcast. And do come on again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, don't go anywhere. In just a moment, we'll be hearing from Irish historian and journalist Ruth Dudley-Edwards, right after this.
Hello, I'm Ben Riley-Smith, the Daily Telegraph's US editor, and I've spent the last year exploring the scandal over links between Donald Trump and Russia for my new podcast, Crossfire. What I found was an extraordinary untold story that kept coming back to Britain.
The big gorilla in the room was, would Trump want to meet Putin? Would Putin then meet Trump?
And he said, and in any case, the Russians might use some material that they have on Clinton.
This is dangerous. This is really dangerous.
I've been tracking down those directly involved, from Washington to Cambridge to Belgravia, to try and find out what really happened and what it can tell us about this year's election.
So we're looking at the backdrop of Russia. We're looking at what they might be trying to do for our election.
Over 6 episodes, I will unpack it all, chunk by chunk, through the voices of those with direct knowledge.
Most people didn't even want to talk to me. I'm a guy getting death threats. I'm a guy whose life has been totally turned upside down.
I will tell you this, whoever it was, I hope they get punished for it.
That's in Crossfire, available now wherever you downloaded this podcast.
Right, we're back in the Red Lion pub. Now, last Saturday, the Irish went to the polls, the first time they voted on a weekend, and what a result. In many ways, it echoed the attempt by Theresa May to sort out Brexit in 2017 with a UK election and delivering more chaos than was there at the beginning. No single party secured enough seats to govern alone. Sinn Féin delivered a shock to the political system by winning the first most preference results, and Irish Taoiseach Leah Varadkar's party came third. Don't forget it was Varadkar who called the election to try and get a clear mandate for the next round of Brexit talks. So with the Irish border still such a talking point, what does it mean for Brexit? Well, here to tell me just that is Irish historian and journalist Ruth Dudley-Edwards. Ruth, it's an honour to have you here for Chopper's Brexit podcast. Is it your first time here at the Red Lion pub?
Certainly not. I have been covering Northern Ireland for a long time.
I know. And nearly 20 years now. I mean, or more than that, more than 20 years.
Close to 30.
Goodness. I mean, so if we look back at last weekend's results, Sinn Féin are trying to form a government now with independent MPs, aren't they?
Yes.
Well, let's start from the UK perspective with Brexit talks, because they want to put a border poll as part of the talks, don't they? They've raised that issue of constitutional change.
They have indeed, and they're doing really what Nicola Sturgeon does in Scotland, which is when things aren't going too well with those areas you're supposed to be in charge of, like health and housing or whatever, you introduce nationalism.
Yeah.
You try to get people worked up on Anglophobia, so that's what they're at. A border poll wouldn't pass in the south.
Wouldn't
let
it?
alone the north. It wouldn't. Yeah, the thing about it is that, I'm convinced that Brexit has put an awful lot of people off both independence and United Ireland. Because there used to be this simple view in Northern Ireland, yes, we'll have a border poll, 50% plus one, we've got a United Ireland, what we've dreamt of all these centuries. Actually, everybody's been looking at Brexit and saying, oh my God, if it's that complicated getting out of the EU, what it's going to be like, we'll have to dismantle the whole constitution.
Because the EU is essentially a trading area, and it's a row about trading and immigration, possibly, and that's really about it. And yet it's pretend if you unite, as you say, Northern Ireland and Ireland itself.
And it's been very funny, actually, watching the penny dropping very slowly and then with a crash. People saying, we'd have to change our constitution. We'd have to change our national anthem. This could be absolute hell. And then they're also thinking, and the leaders of the political parties, apart from Sinn Féin, have been saying, steady on, we don't want this in a hurry. And Bertie Ahern, who was so much involved in the Good Friday Agreement and all that, he said anyone who thinks we could have a United Ireland next year should just go to sleep for a decade.
Do you worry about violence, about if Brexit talks go the wrong way, if there's a hard border after January next year? Do you worry about the return to our violence?
We have violence. We have violence in what are called the dissidents. Now, the dissidents are actually the true believers whose heritage goes back to 1916 and that revolution. And what always happens with republicanism is there's always a new generation of people who think the earlier generation has sold out. And this is the generation that think Gerry Adams and co sold out. So they've been killing people, trying to kill people. They murdered Lyra McKee.
There's a bomb in a lorry, wasn't there, on Brexit Day?
Absolutely.
But diffused.
But if you want the ironies, because there's always lots of wonderful ironies in Ireland, it is that the only political people that have been in favour of Brexit and against the EU are the dissidents, because they think it's an erosion of sovereignty, which is exactly what Sinn Féin used to say until about 5 years ago.
The issue of sovereignty is the thing which drives many Brexiteers on, really.
Absolutely. But Sinn Féin used to be entirely against Brussels until about 5 years ago, when they realised it didn't play well in the south. So they just reverse ferret in the whole thing.
Leo Varadkar, what's going to happen to him?
I think he's had it. I really do.
He gambled on the election and lost, essentially.
Yeah.
He called it early, didn't he?
He doesn't have a very good political sense, really.
He's driven Brexiteers mad here.
He's driven absolutely mad. And he thinks that, because people got a bit worked up in the Republic, he thought that would be a big issue in the election. Turned out something like 1% of people said that Brexit mattered in that election. Yeah.
Really?
As far as they were concerned, was done. Fine.
Yeah.
What about it? Yeah.
That's extraordinary because, of course, that was the argument with Brexiteers in the old days. No one cared about the EU and it fell down the list in 2017. Other things mattered more than Brexit, didn't it? Things like, health and transport and schools. Yeah. But then Boris Johnson made it the issue of the election because of the trauma of 3 years here.
Well, I have to say, Chris, the more I look at the state of Europe and the kind of terrible parties which are coming up there, the more I think that really Boris is a bit of a genius, because what he managed to do was to market himself as the agent of change, running the Conservative Party, which had been in power for 9 years. That takes a genius.
Well, not many say the genius on this podcast, but yeah, perhaps he's managed to channel this kind of nationalistic fervour within the structures of one of the major parties in this country. Is that what you mean?
Within safely. He's channeled it safely.
Okay, so we're recording this in the Red Lion pub, Ruth Dudley-Edwards. Julian Smith has been sacked as Northern Ireland Secretary. What's your first take on that?
I'm sorry about it. I think he was very good compared to most of his predecessors.
He got Stormont back. He had this massive win, didn't he, before Christmas?
Boris felt that he gave something away he shouldn't have given away, but he was told to get Stormont back.
What was that, do you think, he gave away?
It was something about an investigation into the veterans, which is a very twitchy area for Boris. I see that. But it was run past the cabinet. I think, it's Boris is trying to keep veterans happy. There's no question about that. And maybe this is just a sacrificial gesture. But I'd love to know who they're going to replace him with, because he really was on top of stuff. One of the really impressive things about him was that he was listening to people of all shades of opinion.
Well, he used to it. He was chief whip during Brexit talks.
Absolutely.
He's dealt with fractious divides and two sides not talking at all, and he managed to make that happen.
He has. And on the whole, he was well regarded by everybody. And after the shambolic predecessor he had, Karen Bradley,
she made repeated mistakes, didn't she? Therese Villiers was well liked, wasn't she, in Northern Ireland?
She wasn't particularly respected. She kept a very low profile.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, he's liked.
He was liked better.
Yeah, much better. But because of what I knew of Julian Smith, I was thinking he seemed to be ruthless enough to get around stuff. You know, he had actually been really ruthless with both the DUP and Sinn Féin by getting them to sign up to a deal without promising money. They actually thought they were going to get about $6 billion as a bribe, and they're not. You know, so he was a ruthless enough negotiator. And I thought he would get around the issues on legacy. But anyway, we'll never know.
Are you optimistic about the prospects for a border that works after the end of this year, turning back to Brexit?
Well, I do, especially if it ends up with the UK having to pay tariffs. But I mean, we are going to have more problems if Sinn Féin have anything to do with power. They're very effective in Brussels, Sinn Féin. But of course, they're...
The MEPs?
Yeah, they have been. But then, of course, there are fewer of them now because we're out. But I think it's unlikely they're going to get into government. I really do think it's unlikely. And it's interesting watching how they find it impossible to do we're fluffy people who have nothing to do with the past and also keeping the hardliners on. So there were a couple of episodes after the election results of massive triumphalism and Anglophobia breaking out and rebel songs and all that sort of thing. And that upset people down south. They didn't expect that. I mean, it was exactly what was expected up north. So I don't know how you keep reconciling this. I think Mary Lou McDonald has one hell of a job. She would have to get every one of the independents on board, every small party on board to get her into power. I don't think the big parties would go into power.
Is it ever possible that Ireland might join the UK and become in a trading area? Is that ridiculous? Some people joke about it, but is it ridiculous?
Chris, if Brussels goes ahead with tax harmonisation and the Irish realise this will destroy them financially, they will change their tune on an awful lot of things, and you will find a get out of the EU movement really taking off. At the moment, they've only got about 9% of people who want to get out. The Irish electorate is very, very volatile.
Irexit, they call it.
Irexit, yep. It's very, very volatile.
Because there's a common travel area, so there's freedom of movement within the British Isles as things stand. And it's not hard to imagine putting a trading envelope onto that and you have a kind of trading area outside the EU.
I think there are a lot of people who will be very happy with that in due course when they see what's going to happen to them in Brussels.
Because if they start clapping down on the issue of corporation tax, driving away the Googles and the rest who are based there.
Absolutely. It'll destroy the economy. And if on top of that you've got Sinn Féin making mischief, which is all they do, they're wreckers, that's all they know. They never do anything positive. It's not a great time to be Irish.
If you were forecasting the future, how soon could this be a realistic possibility, maybe, of Ireland entering into a trading agreement, leaving the EU and becoming part of this British Isles trading area?
Completely dependent on what happens on tax. And also...
So within 10 years, it could be realistic?
Could be. And an EU army. I mean, Ireland has always been very proud of its neutrality. To a large extent, that meant hiding behind the UK. So those two things would really upset people. So...
Well, Ruth Dudley-Edwards, an absolute expert on this whole area of Ireland and Northern Irish politics. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
I enjoyed it very much, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Boris Johnson might have banned the B word, Brexit, in 10 Downing Street, but is that true for the rest of the population? Lucy Morrell is Associate Director of Britain Thinks, a strategy consultancy that finds out just that, how Britons feel on a number of big issues. And in recent years, Lucy and her team, including Deborah Mattinson, have been working out whether Britons really can get over Brexit. And Lucy joins me now in the Red Lion pub. So Lucy, you've been tracking views on Brexit, haven't you, over the past 3 years, and I've helped present some of your findings. Brexit is over, it's happened. Well, how are people feeling about Brexit now?
So we've been tracking public opinion on Brexit and how people experience the Brexit process since early 2017. And that's something that we've called the Brexit Diaries.
Yes.
And so we've recently conducted our final piece of research in this segment. And what we've found is that all now accept that Brexit is over and just about everybody is ready to move on.
That's not all, because there's still the guy outside the gate of Parliament shouting "Stop Brexit" at me every morning.
Well, we're finding that over 8 in 10 of the public now agree that the UK is leaving the EU and we all need to accept that. And we're even finding that amongst the most ardent Remainers, over 2/3 of them also agree with that and are ready to move on.
Gosh, well, that's a bit of a relief, and no wonder we're changing the name of this podcast shortly to something else. But of course, yes, so Brexit is over with, but there still are Leavers and Remainers with different views on the future, aren't there?
Absolutely. So one thing that we've done at Britain Thinks is try to add some more nuance to the debate. So we've talked a lot about Leavers and Remainers, and what we've talked about instead are 4 different groups of the public. So we start at one end of the scale with those that we call our die-hard Leavers. They're about 1/3 of the population.
Yep.
They're people who voted leave, they're extremely happy about the result, and they have no concerns about leaving. And at the opposite end of the scale, we have those that we've called the devastated pessimists. So they're people who voted Remain, they're completely disappointed about the result and can see no positives at all. And in the middle, we have 2 other groups that combined make up about 1/3 of the population. They're people who either voted leave, voted Remain, can see some concerns about leaving and can also see some positives. And so what we're finding at the moment is that there's a big divide between those 2 groups at either end of the scale. So those die-hard Leavers, that 1/3 of the population, and the devastated pessimists, so those Remainers who are also 1/3 of the population. And so we're finding that this is a really optimistic moment. It's a moment of triumph for our Leavers. 96% of those die-hard Leavers say they feel completely relieved that the UK has left the EU. And by contrast, for Remainers, it's a moment of sadness, it's a moment of anger, and they have a lot of fears for the future. So whereas 96% of those die-hard Leavers are relieved, only 3% of our most ardent Remainers say that they feel relieved.
Gosh,
there's a really big difference
isn't
there.
it? And will that ever come together? Can we all ever just move past this point of having of these diehards and devastated pessimists?
It really seems quite hard to imagine at the moment, and certainly the public agree. 70%, so 7 in 10 people say that they think these divisions are here to stay.
Is there a political benefit from that for any party, the fact that we'll have these divisions still exist, despite, I mean, Boris Johnson wants to get past Brexit, but perhaps the Lib Dems or Labour should gnaw away at that bone and try and get some support that way?
That's really hard to tell. So certainly at the moment, we're seeing that Boris Johnson is performing very well and is seen to have delivered what he promised on Brexit. And the public are now expecting to see him progress on other issues that are really important to them. It certainly seems that he's operating in a little bit of a vacuum at the moment. And when doing focus groups with the public, they have next to nothing to say about Labour or the Lib Dems or any of the new leadership contenders.
I was struck by your findings that Leavers and Remainers have utterly contrasting views of the UK standing in the world. They also appear to interpret the same facts in line with their views of the world and coming to entirely opposite conclusions.
Yeah, I think that's some of the most striking findings that we've had from this research. So what we found is that Leavers are much more likely to think that most other countries need us a whole lot more than we need them. So they say a lot of things like, countries like Germany, we buy their cars, so of course they need us. Whereas Remainers have the complete opposite view. So for them, the UK is out on a limb, we're on our own, we need as many friends as we can get. So, we buy products from different countries, of course we need them.
It's completely entrenched, isn't it? I mean, and if you look at the 2 groups about who Remainers and Leavers think are our allies in the world, do you want to quickly summarise those findings?
Of course. So we asked participants in the focus groups to think about a range of different countries across the world and to tell us whether they thought we needed them or they needed us, or whether we should have a really friendly relationship with them or if we see them more as enemies. So in our group with Remainers, they felt that all of those countries, we need them a whole lot more than they need us. Germany, Japan, China, Argentina, Brazil, France, and they all should be our friends. We asked exactly the same exercise of a group of our die-hard Leavers, and they said exactly the opposite. I think every country bar Australia was an enemy, and they all need us a whole lot more than we need them.
I know, I wasn't quite clear about why China and Japan were in the same bracket there either, but it does seem... And of course, the US is in there as well, and the big issue for this year is who will be the next US president if Donald Trump can get a second term. And a lot of the Leavers felt that Britain's future hangs on that relationship between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump.
Actually, when it comes to the US, this is an area where our Leavers and Remainers are a little bit more joined up in their thinking. So the US is felt to be a good opportunity, but it means relying on a president who you say may not be in place by the end of the year, and also who everyone thinks is so volatile that he can't be trusted. And while all believe that Boris Johnson and Donald Trump have a good relationship, the power is very much felt to lie with Trump. So Boris Johnson is described in focus groups as Trump's mini-me.
Yes.
And so there's big fears that he
Blair,
could take
Tony
advantage.
Blair, of course, was Bush's poodle back in the day. Overall, there was a feeling, wasn't there, that a new era has dawned, has it not, to quote Tony Blair, this year, that Boris Johnson has a key role to play. But how can he unite rather than divide is the question.
That's a really good question. And certainly in terms of thinking about a new era for the UK, 2/3 of the UK think that the Brexit deal and leaving the EU really does start a new era for the country. We're finding that Boris Johnson, there is a lot of pressure on him now to deliver on the rest of the promises that he made in the election campaign. And certainly amongst those die-hard leavers, they're expecting to see a lot more money for the NHS now that we've left the EU. 7 in 10 of them think that that's going to happen.
And also, as the person who came up with the idea of the Brexit 50p piece, I'm very proud of that. You had your panels devise new 50p's, didn't you, which had their own slogans on?
We absolutely did. And so one thing that we found in this is that amongst leavers, there's a real sense that now that we've left the EU, the UK can return to greatness. We can bring the great back into Great Britain. So we asked them to devise their own 50p slogans. We had inscriptions like Rule Britannia or The Future is Brighter. And amongst Remain supporters, we definitely did not have the same. So instead, we had inscriptions such as Farewell to Good Times.
That 50p coin has proved an extraordinarily divisive issue, which is surprising to some people who did support Brexit. And finally, Lucy, the big issue was with Labour, how little the public has engaged with Labour at all on anything, particularly on who the leaders are in the current contest.
Absolutely. In our focus groups, we asked participants who any of the Labour leadership candidates are, and only one person in each group could name any of them at all. The polling on that is quite stark as well. I think Keir Starmer is the candidate with the most recognition, and even for him, it's only a quarter of the public overall.
What's your advice to them? Do you think they should keep banging on about Brexit, or should they move on? I mean, Lisa Nandy clearly has moved on from the very beginning and never backed Theresa May's deal. But with Keir Starmer discussing last week about bringing about freedom of movement, so reigniting that blue touch paper, is this wise?
So that's something that's quite interesting that's come out of the research as well. So we asked participants if they thought that there should be another referendum on rejoining the EU before 2030. We found that over half, so 58% of those that voted Labour in 2019 agreed with that. So clearly the Europe question is still quite big for them. But compared to Conservative voters, that was only 7%. So if Labour want to start moving away from their core voters and getting back some of those that they lost, then perhaps the Europe question should be a closed door.
Goodness gracious. Now, before you go, Lucy, how can listeners see this research?
So the research is published on our website, so britainthinks.com, and we regularly post on there.
And you can also find a link to this research in the show notes to this podcast. Lucy Morrell, Associate Director from Britain Thinks, thank you for coming on Chopper's Brexit Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Chopper's Brexit Podcast. We've recorded 161 episodes of this podcast since the beginning in March 2017. And thank you for listening and being so loyal. For those of you emailing about it, well, we're not going to stop. Thank you for your concern, and we'll carry on. We're busy planning a new show which will start after the parliamentary recess with a new name. Keep subscribed to this feed to be the first to hear the new show. Thanks to my guests this week, Ruth Dudley-Edwards, Giles Kenningham, and of course, Lucy Morrell. And thank you to my superfans this week, Hamza Azhar and Ioana Tufekci. Don't forget, you can get 30 days free access to all of the Telegraph's best online content on politics, business, sport, culture and more at telegraph.co.uk/chopper. And if you're already a Telegraph subscriber and fancy seeing me in conversation with Nigel Farage, Mark Francois and Alison Pearson at our Brexit Heroes event on March the 10th, do click on the link in the show notes or check your Telegraph subscriber rewards page. Thank you to the show's producers, Theo Luludis and Elliot Lampitt. A huge thanks to you for listening, and particularly to Fatty Berry, One-Armed Winder and Sea Dales, who left us reviews on Apple Podcasts. If you like the show, please do the same. It really helps other people find the show if you leave a 5-star rating. If you want to get in touch, we're on Twitter @ChoppersPodcast or email us choppersbrexitpodcast@telegraph.co.uk. And always buy your copy of the Daily Telegraph. Until next time, with a new show, cheerio!